Liberal Democratic Party securing a standalone majority in the lower house of parliament. At present, Takaichi's coalition has a narrow majority in the lower house while the opposition controls the upper house. If, as the exit polls suggest is possible, she gets a two-thirds majority, that would enable her to override upper house opposition to her bills. The results represent a comeback for the LDP, which has suffered 2 electoral defeats in a row. Takaichi could take the results as a mandate to pursue her conservative agenda, including boosting defense spending. Anthony Kuhn, NPR News, Seoul.
The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says BMW North America is recalling more than 87,000 vehicles. The recall relates to an engine starter that can overheat and potentially catch fire. The regulator says dealers will replace the part at no cost. This is NPR.
Support for NPR comes from the Skoll Foundation, dedicated to powering social innovators to transform the world. Learn more at skoll.org. And Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour, a co-production of WNYC Studios and the New Yorker.
Welcome to the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick. At the end of December, Turning Point USA, one of the most important conservative organizations in the country, held its annual conference, America Fest. The speakers included mainstays of conservative media like Tucker Carlson, Riley Gaines, Megyn Kelly, and Jesse Waters. Kicking things off was Ben Shapiro.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Shapiro.
Founder of the Daily Wire and host of one of the most popular podcasts around. Shapiro began by celebrating Charlie Kirk, Turning Point's co-founder, who had been murdered just a few months earlier.
I really believe that the best way to judge the goodness of a man is to see the goodness of his wife and his children. And on that measure, Charlie was unsurpassed. Erica and her children are in all of our hearts.
But Shapiro's real subject that day was the dangers facing the conservative movement. Instead of focusing on opponents on the left or the few remaining never-Trumpers, he looked inward. Shapiro warned of people he called charlatans and grifters. He called out Tucker Carlson by name for friendly interviews with the accused sex trafficker Andrew Tate and with anti-Semites like Daryl Cooper and Nick Fuentes.
If you host a Hitler apologist, Nazi-loving, anti-American piece of refuse like Nick Fuentes, you know, the Nick Fuentes who said that the Vice President of the United States is a, quote, fat race traitor married to a... If you have that person on your show and you proceed to glaze him, you ought to own it.
Shapiro called out Megyn Kelly for hosting Candace Owens, Shapiro's former colleague, who'd been relentlessly pushing a conspiracy theory that Israel was behind the killing of Charlie Kirk.
And when Megyn said this week, quote, my goal and my job here is to try to understand, yes, where Candace is coming from on this, and says she sees no purpose in inserting herself, quote, into this on one side, that is a moral and logical absurdity.
Now, this is not the only rift on the right, of course. You've seen big division between some MAGA leaders and Donald Trump over the Epstein files. But anti-Semitic views are openly embraced in much of the conservative world now, particularly among some young people. And I wanted to ask Ben Shapiro why he thinks that is. We spoke this past week. Ben, for many years now, you've been in the world of what we would call conservative media. From 2012, you were an editor at Breitbart, which is kind of like the Ur publication of the MAGA movement, I think it's fair to say. And you were acquainted there with Steve Bannon and all sorts of people. You look back on those Breitbart days, and what do you think was positive about it? What do you look back on with some regret, too, in terms of the leaders of Breitbart?
So I worked at Talk Radio Network, which was the syndicator for Michael Savage and Laura Ingraham, and then I ended up being hired by Andrew. I'd known Andrew since I was at UCLA.
Andrew Breitbart, the founder of the publication, yes. Who died in his 40s, I think.
Yeah, he's very young. I think he was 41, I believe. Obviously, I'd known Andrew for about 10 years. I think he basically came to me and said, will you come on board and join Breitbart? This was in February 2012. So it was in the middle of the 2012 election cycle. And he died 3-4 weeks after I had signed up for Breitbart. And suddenly the leadership structure was completely upended because Andrew had been sort of a one-man band. He was obviously a charismatic person. He was the person from whom all sort of thoughts sprang in terms of the direction of the site. Obviously, the leadership structure changed pretty dramatically. Steve Bannon, who'd been kind of hanging around on the fringes of Breitbart universe and making a documentary about Andrew, was brought in by Larry Solov, who is Andrew's partner, to essentially be president of Breitbart.
Did you have problems with Steve Bannon?
It was never sort of a bed of roses with Steve Bannon. There were a lot of people in sort of Breitbart infrastructure who are not fond of Steve or the way that he was running things, making editorial decisions and the like. I think that there were some wonderful
But how did you assess what Steve Bannon wanted in this world? He wasn't just a conservative. I mean, he was and remains a kind of warrior who's willing to say and do what is necessary to push that battle forward. And I'm being gentle about this.
If you look at the coverage of Breitbart, say circa 2012, 2013, I'd say those are fairly mainstream conservative talking points. I mean, it was certainly a mainstream conservative website at that time. I think by the time we hit 2015, 2016, things had started to evolve a fair bit, especially because of the rise of President Trump. I was not a supporter of President Trump in the 2015-2016 election cycle. I was much more supportive of Ted Cruz in the primaries, and then in the general election, I actually didn't vote in 2016 because I was unhappy with both candidates. Obviously, post that, I think President Trump did many things that as a conservative I like. He is a certainly non-ideological figure, which is why so many people try to sort of claim that MAGA is part of their movement. You have Reagan conservatives who will say that MAGA is Reagan conservatism. You'll have national populists who say that it's a national populist. Trump is none of those things. Right? Trump is Trump, and he has instincts.
Which means what? Trump means what?
His instincts are sort of naturally those of a 1975 conservative, and that means that he likes strong America on the world stage, but tempered by a sort of hard-nosed realism about non-interventionism. I think that when it comes to domestic policy, he has sort of a weird mix of not liking the government to be involved in everything, but also wanting to use the government in ways that I don't particularly approve. He seems to be more about, what is the solution at hand? Will I try it? And then if it doesn't work, then he pulls out of it. So people have termed that taco, right? Trump always chickens out. I don't think that's right. I think that President Trump is a person who is willing to try different things and then will shift on a dime if he doesn't think those things work.
You think Trump is honest?
I mean, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no.
There's an article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago describing the fishy investments from Abu Dhabi and the Trump family. Kirkpatrick was extremely conservative in his calculations about how he's assessing this. I said that the Trump family has enriched itself to the tune of $4 billion since taking office again in conservative.
Of course, I mean, I've been calling this out, I think, before pretty much anybody else. I mean, early on in the Trump administration, when World Liberty Financial was pretty clearly making a fair bit of money over in the Middle East, I raised red flags on my show consistently about how I thought this was wrong. If the name were Biden instead of Trump, people would be screaming bloody murder, and how this was not beneficial to President Trump's agenda either. So, sure, that
Well, not beneficial to his agenda.
I mean, both, obviously. I mean, I do think that if you are taking, what I perceive to be digital assets that are not particularly worthwhile, and then you have people who are politically interested in investing massive amounts of money into those things, that is not a good thing.
You voted for him a second time?
I voted for him in 2020, and then I campaigned for him in 2024.
Why?
Because it was now a binary choice between Trump and Kamala Harris, and I liked a lot what he did during his first administration. I felt the guardrails would largely hold, which I believe they have, with regard to President Trump. I know many on the left believe they've not, but what I would say is that
guardrails have held this time?
yes, I'm hard pressed to
Help
see.
me on that then.
Sure.
Because I don't see it even remotely the case, so I hear you.
Sure. So the Trump administration has not bucked the judiciary to the tune of simply saying that if an appellate court or the Supreme Court rules a particular way, they will just go ahead and do whatever it is that they want to do. The president does cite legal authority for things that he is doing.
So you're confident that the Justice Department will pursue corruption charges against the Trump family?
I'm confident that the president will likely pardon himself and his children in the same way that Joe Biden did on his way out. I think
you're laughing, but that's
radically
corrupt, is it not?
Again, I think that was radically corrupt when the DOJ did not pursue, with alacrity, a lot of the issues surrounding the Biden family too. I think one of the things. So the answer is yes, and it applies to all parties. what I hear from the left is a constant drumbeat of accusation about President Trump, to which I acquiesce in part. But I find them utterly unconcerned with the same sorts of issues arising on their side of the aisle. They see President Trump as the person who's constantly violating the standard, the person who's constantly setting the new standard. I think President Trump stumbled on the prone body of American politics and said, this is a dead body. I see him much more as a foreigner than as the murderer. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some vote. I think things can get worse under President Trump than they were heretofore. And I'm not going to deny that he's done things that I think are bad and wrong. I was very critical of his rhetoric, for example, between the election of 2020 and January 6th. But I do think that to ignore the fact that
any of these things, do you not see any of these things as disqualifying in moral political sense? Like election, January 6th, for example.
Right, so I don't know what disqualifying means in the sense that I did not support him in the primaries.
That he would lose your faith and vote and support forever.
Well, the only way to lose my faith and support and vote forever would be for there to be an alternative that I find superior to him. This is the problem. When you're making voting decisions, would I want Donald Trump marrying into my family? Probably not. When it comes to my politicians, the problem is that once you say that the candidate is quote unquote disqualified, then you either have to sit out the election, which I did in 2016, right? I found both candidates to be insufficient. And then whatever damage President Trump I thought had done by being elected in 2016, I thought that he did a bunch of things I liked between 2016 and 2020. And then I did not like what he did with regard to the election of 2020 and what I think are falsehoods that he told about winning that election. And I didn't support him in the primaries, and then he ended up winning the nomination. He was running against Kamala Harris. So I can either sit out the election again, which doesn't really achieve.
So what you're saying is that the potential of Kamala Harris, in your view, outweighs support for what in essence was an insurrection on Capitol Hill. That's hard for me. That's just to say the least. I
think that's first of all, I think that that's a pretty poor way of putting it. That's not the way that we assess candidates in the real world. The way that we assess candidates in the real world is who is more likely to perform the agenda that I see as important versus who is more likely to inhibit that agenda. And so I can fully disapprove of what happened on January 6th and think it was quite terrible, and still acknowledge that Donald Trump as president from 2017 to 2021 did a better job than I think Joe Biden.
There are many people who consider themselves never-Trumpers in the Republican Party. Not a decisive amount, certainly, but there's certainly a number of people in the Republican Party who see his moral transgressions as so serious that they make a very different calculation than you do.
Sure, and they're entitled to that calculation. The question to me is always one of iteration. Okay, voting is one decision, and then supporting just because you vote for someone doesn't mean that you support everything that they do.
I'm speaking with the podcaster Ben Shapiro. We'll continue in just a moment. This is the New Yorker Radio Hour.
The New Yorker Radio Hour is supported by Swan Auction Galleries, an auction house of collectors for collectors since 1941, offering live in-person auctions in New York City and online live bidding from afar. Swan's auction schedule is available at swangalleries.com. And by Odoo. Odoo streamlines every aspect of a company into one simple business management platform. More information at odoo.com.
We know you value Houston Public Media. That's why you're listening right now. Take the next steps and become a new member of the station you rely on. Every gift makes a difference. And what matters most right now is supporting the station that brings you the news and information you rely on. It only takes a few minutes to make a big difference. Join as a new member today at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
This week on the Sam Sanders Show, actor and comedian Sherry Cola.
You know what's funny? Sometimes I see my therapist as like a captive audience. What is it about like wanting to make your therapist laugh? Oh my god, like a true comedy special.
Yeah. Sherry Cola on mental health and coming out to her immigrant family.
It's Maria Hinojosa, host of Latino USA. We all love great stories, and great stories are what we pride ourselves in delivering to you every week. Latino USA presents a mix of reporting on culture and politics, diverse voices, and coverage of current and emerging issues, featuring stories from the heart, stories that will make you think and maybe even inspire you. Listen to Latino USA from PRX.
Sundays at 7 p.m. on News 88.7.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick, and I've been speaking today with Ben Shapiro, one of the most prominent voices in conservative media. The Ben Shapiro Show started in 2015, and it often ranks in the top 10 podcasts in America. Shapiro worked as a lawyer at first. He went to Harvard Law School and practiced for a time. But he's been sharing his political opinions for much longer than that. He had a column when he was 17 years old while he was a student at UCLA. Shapiro was a morning show host on Los Angeles radio, an editor at Breitbart News, and eventually he co-founded his own conservative media outlet called The Daily Wire. We'll continue our conversation with him now. You had your first syndicated column, as most 17-year-olds do, when you were a teenager. How did that happen?
So when I went to UCLA, I skipped a couple of grades. I went to UCLA when I was 16, and I walked onto campus. I picked up a copy of UCLA Daily Bruin. I saw an editorial that I thought was pretty terrible.
What did it say? What was the...
I believe that the editorial at the time was comparing Ariel Sharon, then Prime Minister of Israel, to Adolf Eichmann, the creator of the Nazi concentration camp system. And so I went in and I asked if I could write a counterpoint. And they said, sure. So I wrote a counterpoint. And then they said, we need somebody. We can't find anybody who's on the other side to write a sort of counterpoint on Iraq. And I said, okay, I can think about doing that. So I did that. So I wrote a counterpoint column for the Daily Bruin for a while. And then that turned into just a regular column. After about a year of doing that, I was talking with my father. And I said, do you think that my stuff is good enough to be printed in like a normal newspaper? He said, let me do some research. And he came up with a place called the Creator Syndicate. So I printed out some of my columns from Daily Bruin. I sent them in, and about 3 weeks later, I got a call from them asking if I would write a syndicated weekly column for them. And that's how it started.
So you were fully formed as a conservative at age 17. How did that happen?
So I mean, I was always very into history. I was always very into politics. I read a lot, obviously, and so I had, I think pretty strong opinions on a lot of subjects. I won't say that they were as well informed as I'd hope they are 25 years later. In the era prior to kind of full-scale social media, I was unlucky enough to have a syndicated column at the age of 17, meaning that many of my dumbest thoughts from ages 18 to 25 are on record.
What were your dumbest thoughts that you...
I mean, there's like a whole list of them. I mean, I actually put up a list on our website over at Daily Wire. There were some thoughts about, for example, civilian casualties in the Afghanistan war that were poorly articulated, thoughts about the Israel and Palestinian issue that were poorly articulated or wrong that I retracted later. So some of them, is when you're young and in this field, one of the ways you get attention is by saying overtly provocative things. That has not changed. And so a lot of the ways that I would articulate things at the age of 19 are not the ways that I would articulate them today.
Would you say that you do that now, that you push the boundaries of what you really think to get attention?
No. I would say that I really don't do that very much.
So let's talk about the college campus that you came onto, because we hear a lot about it. That LA is completely left-leaning, and then we have the evidence of you walking into the newspaper offices and you had a column. So what was it like UCLA when you came in?
I would never say that it was terrible for me to go to a left-leaning college. There's no question that UCLA was a left-leaning university. It wasn't a place I felt as though I couldn't express my opinions. I will admit that when it came time for taking tests, depending on how restrictive I thought the professor was, I think that the best way to get an A in a class is to write what the professor would like you to write, as opposed to what you would like to write.
But you didn't do that. And you went to Harvard Law School. Of course I did. Yeah, of course I did. You made your opinions conform to the professor?
In the blue book, right? I mean, so the blue books were the way you would handwrite your essays. And so if I had a professor who I thought was very much to the left and intolerant of particular opinions, then I would do that. And that wasn't every left-wing professor that I had. Some were quite eager or welcoming of differing opinions. But I won't say that every single professor was equally welcoming of differing opinions.
Ben, what initially attracted you to conservatism?
I grew up in a household with 2 Reagan Republicans. Obviously, my parents are pretty conservative. The basic idea that I think lies behind a good conservatism is personal responsibility, duty, a requirement that you do the right thing, a basic moral stance about how individuals should act in a free country. And I think that's still largely what drives my conservatism today. I think that I take it pretty seriously.
That's antithetical to liberalism?
It doesn't have to be, but I think that liberalism very often is a way of shielding people from the consequences of their own decisions, or an attempt to shift individual responsibility onto systems in a way that I think is frequently unjustified. The right acknowledges that when people fail, because human nature is fallible, very often that is your own responsibility, and the best way to actually treat with that is to self-correct. And I think that for the left, because they have, I think, a rosier view of what human nature is, they tend to attribute to systems that which I think more properly lies in responsibility of the individual.
Let's talk about the debate that you're having inside MAGA. You're at the center of a feud that's developing in the conservative movement, and it has to do with anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories related to anti-Semitism. Not long after Charlie Kirk died, you spoke at the Turning Point Conference, America Fest, and you called out Candace Owens and attendees like Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson. These are very influential figures now on the right and the media of the MAGA movement. Talk to me a little bit about this divide, how it's developed, what it's done to your relationships as well inside the MAGA.
So, I mean, first of all, as people may suspect, I'm not particularly interested in my sort of personal relationships with others in the political sphere. I have a family that's very tight-knit. I have 4 children going on 5. I have a dog. I have plenty of things going on in my social calendar, and I don't see it as particularly important to hang out with people who are in sort of the same career milieu.
Well, then tell me about your decision to make that speech.
Sure. There were 2 speeches that I gave back to back. One was a speech that I gave at the Heritage Foundation the night before, and one was the TPUSA speech that I gave that night. The Heritage Foundation speech was specifically directed at Tucker Carlson, because I believe that Tucker Carlson is not a conservative in any real marked way that I can identify. And I was pointing that out at the Heritage Foundation.
How would you describe his politics?
Conspiratorial populism. I try not to speculate on motivations of people because I just don't have a window into their head. All I can say is that the stuff that he has been promoting for the past several years is very much in line with the philosophies of people like Alexander Dugin. It is very much in line.
The Russian nationalist philosopher said to be close to at least the thinking of Vladimir Putin.
Yes, his view of America in the world is a view that is actually closer to Howard Zinn than I think to that of sort of traditional conservatives. This idea that America is a nefarious and terrible force in the world that has committed myriad sins and must withdraw from the world both for its own good and for the good of the world. His belief that a conspiratorial coterie of people is manipulating American policy. Those people very often happen to have crossover with Jews, according to his guests, that he routinely wanders onto the air. In the aftermath of Charlie's death, Candace Owens, in particular, had started speculating openly that people at TPUSA, up to and including in my interpretation, Erica Kirk, Charlie's wife, had been complicit in his murder, or at least complicit in a cover-up of his murder.
If Charlie said he had no choice but to abandon the pro-Israel cause because of, and I quote, Jewish donors, the behavior of Jewish donors, if he said that, yes or no, well then, I don't know, maybe some people didn't want to take that risk that he was going to become Candace Owens and Tucker Carlson.
Her bizarre conspiratorial rantings had been treated as legitimate and worthwhile by people ranging from Tucker Carlson to Megyn Kelly. And so I felt that this was a necessary speech to make about the gap that has emerged on the right between a conspiratorial view of politics promoted by commentators who seem to bear less responsibility for truth-telling than I think they do. And that sort of conspiratorialism has taken over large parts of the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
Were you surprised by Candace Owens? I believe is somebody that you worked with at the Daily Wire.
Yeah, we hired her in 2021.
What did you see her
and then we fired her in 2023. So in 2021, what we saw was a fairly, I would say, mainstream conservative who said inflammatory things, obviously, and who had been telling us that she...
Inflammatory things that you like.
Some that I would say most of them that I like. Some of them not as much. And so, you know, as people who hired her, we thought that she was going to develop in sort of, you know, intellectual directions. She had said that she was learning with Shelby Steele, for example, and Rosa Thomas Sowell and all this kind of thing. By 2022, it was apparent that she was moving in another direction, and then it took until 2023 for that direction to come to full fruition, which was fairly open anti-Semitism. She was spouting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, among other conspiracy theories, including the idea that Emmanuel Macron's wife is actually a man, and all this sort of stuff. And so at that point...
So that was your limit with her?
Well, that was... To be fair, I am not an officer of my company. The people who made that decision were Jeremy Boring and Caleb Robinson, the co-CEOs of the company. But that was the collective management decision, yes.
And now you specifically criticized Tucker Carlson for a really soft interview he did with a guy named Nick Fuentes. You point out how outrageous he is. But is that exactly what Carlson wants in his guest? Just attention?
I mean, I think that probably the attention doesn't hurt, but at the same time, I think that probably there is some ideological overlap between some of the things that he believes about America and the conspiratorial forces controlling it, and some of the stuff that Nick Fuentes believes. You know, what Tucker has a habit of doing is bringing on guests who spout the most conspiratorial form of the theory, and then he sort of buys it back about 5%, and then he allows those views to be predominant in the public discourse while talking about what wonderful people these folks are.
Okay, but I get that, sure. And I can't help but agree with that, obviously. But then you have Donald Trump. He hasn't had dinner with me, but he's had dinner with Nick Fuentes. So how does that affect your feeling about Donald
obviously,
Trump?
I mean, I condemned that at the time when it comes to his dinner with Fuentes, and I believe it was Kanye West. It was Kanye West and Fuentes. The president of the United States, and people say that I grade on a curve, but I think I grade realistically here. I am not surprised by what President Trump does. He likes being with famous people. He very, very often does not know who they are. He will throw them out. He will say bad things about them 5 minutes later. He will like Steve Bannon until he calls him sloppy Steve and fires him, whereupon he will welcome him back into his orbit and like him again. And so the sort of attempt to treat...
I think you're taking this too casually. He's having dinner with a Nazi apologist.
And I didn't take that casually.
And then really doesn't go off and blast him. He just kind of says, oh, I kind of didn't know who it was, and Kanye brought him along. First of all, that's bad staff work, to say the least.
Terrible staff work.
And it's bad behavior on the part of the President of the United States, no?
I agree that it's bad behavior on the part of the President of the United States. I'm not sure what else to say about that.
What's the equivalent?
I don't think that's quite the same thing as Tucker Carlson legitimately using his forum to provide Nick Fuentes a way to speak to the public for
fair
2
enough.
hours.
That's a pretty low bar.
No, I agree, but those are the two things you're comparing.
Now, at America Fest, the Vice President said this.
President Trump did not build the greatest coalition in politics by running his supporters through endless, self-defeating purity tests. I didn't bring a list of conservatives to denounce or to deplatform, and I don't really care if some people out there, I'm sure we'll have the fake news media, denounce me after this speech.
He was kind of attacking you, wasn't he?
I mean, I assume that he was disagreeing with the thing that I had said, sure. And I will point out that I don't think the Vice President is being very accurate about his own approach to various conservatives and other people online. He's quite fond of attacking people online from time to time. So,
I remember when a bunch of, I think it was young Republican leaders, had their Signal chat exposed, and they were making all kinds of anti-Semitic remarks on that, and the Vice President didn't denounce that either. In fact, he just kind of thought it was, kids being kids.
Right, and again, I highly disagree with this as both a matter of morality and as a matter of tactics. I think tactically it's foolish. I think it's immoral.
What's going on? What's going on that this is so prevalent and excused? Top end of at least part of the conservative media sphere and the White House.
I mean, I think it's a mirror image of what's going on the left. I think to pretend that anti-Semitism is not rising on both the right and the left is to be whistling past the graveyard.
But
and one of the
fair
things,
enough, but stick to the right.
The reason that I'm pointing this out, I understand, but Democrats would like to be in office. And so, again, to go back to sort of the original point with regard to President Trump and voting for him and not voting for him, if the question is binary choice, then you're going to have to make a decision between one of these parties, because these are the two major parties. And so that's why I think it's important to bring into perspective what's happening in both parties.
But Ben, do you see anti-Semitism in the mouths of leading Democratic contenders for the presidency?
I see anti-Semitism in the Democratic Party apparatus's willingness to not only humor but to promote everybody ranging from New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani to Rashida Tlaib, Congresswoman from Michigan, to Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman from Minnesota, to the bizarre attempt to mirror all of the excesses of the anti-Israel movement. And I don't just mean anti-Netanyahu, I mean anti-Israel. But listen, I asked Gavin Newsom about this, right? I was on Gavin's broadcast, the governor of California, and he acknowledged that this sort of stuff has become quite prevalent in sort of Democratic circles. So the reason that I'm pointing this out is, number one, because I think it's important just as a matter of description to be realistic about the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, period. And then I'm happy to discuss the problems on my own side. Yeah,
and you have talked about anti-Semitism on the left. We can discuss that as well. But the degree of it on the right take you by surprise.
Yes, sure. First of all, to understand what's happening, I think we first have to understand what anti-Semitism actually is, because I think that when people mischaracterize the definition, that allows their particular side to escape. So what people tend to do is they will define anti-Semitism in a way that excuses their side and then throws all of the blame on the other side. The definition of anti-Semitism at its root is a conspiracy theory about the power of Jews as a group in the world. And that can be channeled into an anti-Zionism that says that Israel is controlling American foreign policy and that Israel has befuddled the world. It's all about Benjamins, which is the kind of thing that Ilhan Omar says. Or it can be channeled into Jews in America are too powerful in the media and they are cliquish and they are controlling the circumstances of my life.
And yet, Ben, as somebody who's written from Israel and Palestine for years and years, and the reaction to some of the things I write is that I'm an anti-Semite, which is, I got to say, news to me. But I'm no more anti-Semitic than you are, and to get attacked like that is hideous.
Okay, but so this is why I'm trying to be more precise about the definition. Right? Being critical of Israeli policy is not the same thing as saying, for example, that Israel's government designed and implemented a genocide, which is a lie. Okay, and that is a lie that can be chalked up to a nefarious view of what Jews are doing in the world, because it is also part and parcel of a broader lie, which the Jews have then sold the idea that they are capable of doing whatever they want under the guise of America's banner, and they've done so because of their inordinate power, right? It's part of a broader conspiracy theory. And so one of the things that's happened is in much the same way that the right said for a long time, you keep calling everybody racist, therefore nobody's a racist, which is untrue, right? There are actual racists out there.
There are.
But the idea is that if you over-apply a category, then it starts losing its power and its effectiveness, and that actually opens the door to the thing. I think the same thing has happened with anti-Semitism. And so what I've said before is, instead of talking in categories of anti-Semitism or Jew hatred or the rest of it, why don't we talk about what's true and what's false and what's moral and what's not moral? Because that's easier for people to get their head around.
Ben, let me ask you about another extremely potent issue, not just in the Republican Party, and that's the Epstein files. You've been following this. What do you think it proves or doesn't prove, other than the absolute hideous nature of the subject himself?
I think that let's put it this way, the virality of the narrative around the Epstein files is different from what the evidence shows in the Epstein files. What the evidence shows in the Epstein files is that you have a number of very high-profile people who are in close contact with Jeffrey Epstein, who was a convicted sex offender with minors. The indictments against Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell suggest that the trafficking of minors was about Jeffrey Epstein. There's no one else who's been indicted in terms of trafficking of minors except for Jeffrey Epstein. And according to the FBI under President Trump, there's no one who's going to be, because they do not have evidence sufficient that he was trafficking young girls to other people. The narrative that has been drawn from the Epstein story, because presumably people don't know where his money comes from, although there was a very, very deep dive, I believe, in New York Times Magazine looking into where his money came from. The narrative is a broader narrative that goes back to kind of the heart of conspiracy theorizing that has taken over, I think, large swaths of both parties, but it is very, very potent on the right. And that is that there's a cadre of people who are preying upon children, who manipulate everything in your life, who may be doing so because they have been honeypotted or because they are being manipulated by a foreign intelligence service, typically on the right. On the far right, this is treated as Mossad, even though there's zero evidence that that is the case. And then Ehud Barak's name is brought up in this context. As you might imagine, I'm not a fan of Ehud Barak, but there is no evidence that on behalf of Mossad, he was running Jeffrey Epstein as a sex trafficking agent. By the way, it'd be pretty terrible statecraft considering he was already a convicted sex offender. I think that the broader theory here, which goes well beyond the evidence, the morality of that theory speaks to people's belief that they are not in control of their own lives and that conspiratorial forces who prey on children, which is obviously the best way to if you wish to have the most nefarious form of the most nefarious theory that you've got, making the pedophiles is a great way to do it. But the attempt to kind of draw out a gigantic pedophilic conspiracy ring that was running all of America's foreign policy and domestic policy and culture, I think that goes to people's desire to abdicate control over their own lives, which I think gets back to some of my original politics, right? Which is where I was saying that I think individual responsibility is the lodestar of a successful society. And when you have conspiratorialism take over, as Karl Popper suggested, it's a massive problem.
My guest is the commentator and podcast host, Ben Shapiro. Our conversation continues in a moment on the New Yorker Radio Hour.
The New Yorker Radio Hour is supported by Odoo. Odoo streamlines every aspect of a company into one simple business management platform. More information at odoo.com. Seed.com. Seed's DS-01 is a 24-strain 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic engineered to survive digestion, support healthy regularity, and promote whole body health. Learn more at seed.com/public.
You count on Houston Public Media. That's why you're here right now. Take the next step and become a new member today. Every gift makes a difference. And with a gift of $5 or more per month, you'll receive PBS Passport, a member benefit that lets you stream more of the shows you love anytime. It only takes a few minutes to make a big difference. Become a new member today at HoustonPublicMedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
At the South Pole, scientists have buried two seismometers 8,000 feet below the ice.
One is called Dr. Bob, and the other one is named P-Storm.
These highly sensitive machines are tuned to listen for earthquakes, and scientists hope they'll tell us more about the Earth's composition and movements. I'm Emily Kwong. That's on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Hi, I'm John Donvan, host of Open to Debate, where we bring you open-minded discussions and debates about the issues affecting our lives. Everything from science and tech to politics, culture, and foreign policy. In our divided nation, we feel it's more important than ever for people to be open-minded, open to disagreement, and open to listening to the other side. Join me in being open to debate.
Sunday night at 10 p.m. on News 88.7.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Wright. My guest today is the commentator Ben Shapiro. Shapiro has maintained an enormous audience, especially among conservatives. But he walks a fine line. He's not exactly MAGA, certainly not all the time. He's taken issue with some of Donald Trump's positions, not to mention his ethics. And earlier in our conversation, Shapiro frankly acknowledged real corruption on Trump's part. But he's very quick to accuse the left of pearl-clutching, too. And he tends to find that whatever he may object to with Trump, Trump's opponents share equally in the blame. Is Donald Trump and the MAGA movement healthy for this country, or would you rather see the Republican Party return to the roots that you started out as a conservative Republican? Do you see promise in the people that have been put forward as successors to Donald Trump? J.D. Ransom.
I have differential opinions on a wide variety of these people. Right? The president obviously picked a dance for his vice president. If vice president were in a primary with Marco Rubio, I would like to support Marco Rubio in that primary over J.D. Vance, for example. The president did pick Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. And so I like, I think that when we say, are there options that I like better than others? Sure. Are there things about the Trump movement that I think have been good and salutary? Sure. Do I think that is he my ideal? if I could construct in my head the ideal Republican candidate or president, would it look exactly like Donald Trump? No, but I'm not sure that he's claiming to be that, nor do I have that magical power. I'm going to try as I might to manifest that in real life.
What do you think Donald Trump cares about?
And I try not to get into motivations because I'm not a psychiatrist, but here's the nice thing about President Trump. When you asked if he was honest before, I said in some ways yes, in some ways no. And we got to the ways in no, but we never got to the ways in yes. The way in yes is that whatever is in his head is going to come out his mouth in the next 2.7 seconds. There is no brain-mouth barrier for President Trump.
That's not so much honesty as impulsivity.
Well, I mean, it's honesty in the sense that you are getting his honest take on what he thinks in that moment. It may be an impulsive approach to honesty, but it is definitely there is a definition of honesty by which it's
revealing. I'll give you that.
It is revealing. It is authentic. Don't call it authentic. It's authentic. But as far as what is sort of the core of his sort of political belief, again, I think he has an instinct that he wants America to be great and powerful in the world. He likes the symbolism of America being great and powerful in the world. America is strong, right? America is virile. Like these are things that clearly he does believe. And so the way that manifests in policy may be grabbing Nicolas Maduro and taking him back to New York for trial, or it may be an industrial policy that is more reminiscent of a 1937 FDR policy than it is of a traditional sort of Reagan Republican policy.
We're finding more to be sympathetic about with Vladimir Putin than Zelensky.
So when it comes to Putin and Zelensky, again, that one I cannot explain from a sort of America great perspective. I think that the president
Can't you explain it in terms of he is impressed by, taken with the kind of authoritarian impulses and behavior of Putin rather than Zelensky? So same with Xi Jinping.
I think that he is attracted by powerful people for sure. I'm not going to. He has sort of varied fairly widely, actually, over the course of the last year and a half on Russia and Ukraine. And I've been very consistent that I think that we ought to be supporting Ukraine sufficient to deter the Russian threat and to force Putin at the table.
Now, I want to ask you about Minneapolis, which is still going on. Just from a free speech point of view, from a First Amendment point of view, should somebody like Donald Lemon be prosecuted?
I mean, obviously, if what he was doing was performing an act of journalism, the answer is no. And the question is going to be whether they can prove in court that he was actually a conspirator in the violation of the FACE Act.
Are you worried about Donald Trump's regard for journalists? He's obviously infatuated them. He loves to talk to them, but he refers to them as enemies of the people. And as a student of history, that's a phrase that comes from Robespierre. It comes from Stalin, and it has consequences.
I mean, again, he's been doing that for 10 years, and you seem to have a robust audience and the ability to speak freely every day. And I don't think that you're sitting in your studio right now waiting for the FBI to break down your door.
You think he's just kidding around? Well, the FBI had no problem breaking down the door of the Washington Post reporter and taking all her devices recently.
And if you go back to the Obama administration, James Rosen was treated quite similarly when he was working for Fox News. And then the Associated Press, I think, had some situations with the Obama administration as well. Like this is why I go back to, is Trump breaking the ground here, or is he using tools that were left over from other administrations in ways that other people don't like? And I don't like it either. I mean, him suing various outlets, I think, is wrong and bad. Do I think that we are now at grave threat that the First Amendment is ended in the United States because Don Lemon was picked up by the DOJ?
But Ben, sooner or later, he's not going to like what you say, and your turn is going to come, and you're going to be deposed, and you're going to be sued. And will that change your view of this?
Not particularly. I mean, I'm not. Again, I think that it's wrong for him to do the suing of these outlets. Right. So I'm not sure what would change about my opinion, given that I've said already that I think that it's wrong. It might hurt more if he did it to me.
Let me get a little inside about.
You notice that I'm not excusing any of the things that I think he's doing that are wrong. And this is why one of the things that I think that if people on the opposite side of the aisle actually wanted to be shooting for a better future here, which is I think what we would all like. It's not enough to simply rail against Trump and say this is not normal. It's why I think that people on the left should do some of the same with their own side. Much of what we talked about here is me criticizing my own